This page introduces the concept of state and lifecycle in a React component. You can find the detailed component API reference here. Consider the ticking clock example of one of the previous sections. In rendering elements. We have only learned one way to update the UI. We call the React render to change the rendered output. True, we call it multiple times. Yeah. In this section, we will learn how to make the clock component truly reusable and encapsulated. It will set up its own timer and update itself every second, so you don't have to call it again and again. Good. So we have a function here, so we are just encapsulating it into a component, and we pass in this clock, and that tick happens every 1000 milliseconds, so this calls it multiple times. But this logic, we need to put it inside the function here. That's what we want to do. However, it misses a crucial requirement. The fact that clock sets up a timer and updates the UI every second should be an implementation detail of the clock. Ideally, we want to write this once and have the clock update itself like this. To implement this, we need to add a state to the clock component. State is similar to prop, but it is private and fully controlled by the component. So what is the difference between state and prop? But it is private. Okay. Converting a function to a class. You can convert function to a class like this, and a single empty method should be there, render. Move the body of the function into the render, replace the props with this dot props. So this is how it's going to be using clock. We need to replace the props as this dot props now. That's it. That's the major difference between an ES6 class or a function. Clock is now defined as a class rather than a function. The render method will be called each time an update happens, but as long as we render clock into the same DOM node, only a single instance of the clock class will be used. Let us use additional features such as local state and lifecycle methods. Adding local state to a class, we will move date from props to state in 3 steps. Replace this props.date with state.date. I see, inside the render function. Okay. I was just reading again. Did I miss anything? No, quite simple. Why we have done that? We don't know, but we'll see. Add a class constructor that assigns this initial state. Oh, you now take in props and then you create a copy of it. That's what I told, right? If you want to do any manipulations on it, just create a copy of it. That's what they're doing right now. So you need to create a copy because it's private. That's what I said also. That private is something which can only be accessed by this class, not by the above ones. Even now, this constructor wise, it should not be required. Yeah, this should be removed in the future, and I will tell you how it's going to be removed when we will come to hooks. Where did hooks go? Hooks, there it is. Hooks are the new way to actually use states, so we are not going to start coding until we get to hooks though. This style is kind of outdated right now, very outdated, but we need to know how hooks came into place, what problems hooks solved, and how to use hooks, and that will be really helpful if we go through the history of it. But this is something that is not used anymore, just to let you know. But still, it's important. That's why I'm still reading it twice. I have done it gone through this part till state and life cycle on my own, but I'm doing it again because it's important. So now a note how we pass props to the base constructor. So we take it props, we call the super function of it. And why do we call the super function? It was something related to JavaScript. Let me see. JavaScript class super MDN web. Wow, it's so good. Learn about the MDN's web docs new design today. This came out today, like few hours ago probably, because I used MDN in Deloitte and it was not like this. It's insane. A new year, a new MDN. Can't go back. The old MDN. I don't see any link here. A new logo chosen by our community. Sheesh. Oh, this is a forward slash, a pipe symbol, forward slash, and a pipe symbol. And also this legends is good. I can directly go to this description, examples, specification. If you see, they don't do a smooth scroll like we do. They do a very harsh stop, because smooth scroll is not supported in most of the browsers, and that's why I told that it's a little bit of JavaScript as well when we are doing the smooth scroll. Okay, coming back to the super. What does our super do? Syntax is super keyword is used to access and call functions on parents objects parent. So super.prop and super expression are okay. So it only works with classes, and then what you do is when you call if you know Java, you already know what super does, but I forgot what super does. So we have a rectangle class here. We the square class is inheriting a rectangle class here, and this dot height becomes a reference error. This might be a little smaller for you guys to see. Okay, height, a reference error. Super needs to be called first. Here it is called It calls the parent class constructor with length. So length and length, it takes length here and it creates the height name. Okay, it takes a height and width, right? So when you call super, it's going to call this constructor here. So then now you have height, you have width. I see. You have height, you have width, and you have name as well. And now you can rename the name. In derived classes, super must be called before you can use this. Leaving this out will cause a reference error. Great. So they have made sure that you need to if whenever you are extending a class, you need to call super first, and that needs to be done on top because reference error will come. Okay, great. Coming back. So when we call super, we are extending something, right? So we were extending react.component, and now when we call super, then react.components constructor gets called, and what that constructor does is probably just initialize the state. Or not even that, maybe just initialize few properties of it. We are not really sure why do we need to call. Okay, maybe they have told it, right? Yeah, they have told that you have to call super. No matter what happens, you have to call super. That's something that I don't really like, that you have to call super even though you don't need to use anything in React component. Kind of cringe, bro. Okay. The state becomes new date, and class component should always call the base constructor with props. Yeah, we have seen why it needs to do that. Remove the date prop from clock element. We will later add the timer code back to the component itself, so the result looks like this. So initialize, the state will initialize as having a JSON object with date as the one key, and then we would have the state.date locale time string, so it will just create it to a time string here. How does it update itself? Okay, we are going to do that later. Adding lifecycle methods to a class. Lifecycle, if you guys know about Angular, you might know about lifecycle. So I don't know about React lifecycle methods, but let's see. In application with many components, it's very important to free up resources taken by the components when they are destroyed. We want to set up a timer when the clock is rendered to the DOM for the first time. This is called mounting in React. So if you guys know about Angular, this is called ng-on in it. And then we also want to clear the timer whenever the DOM produced by the clock is removed. This is called unmounting. We can declare special methods on the component class to run some code with when a component unmounts and mounts. Component did mount, component will unmount. Did mount well, yeah, this is good. This naming is good, kind of, because now we know that this whatever code that you have written here, the component has already mounted, and this is just before it's going to get unmounted. So when we do ng on destroy, it doesn't make it very clear that when this function is going to call. Is it going to be called after the element leaves the DOM, or it's going to be before? So this clears that up. These methods are called lifecycle methods. Component did mount method runs after the component output has been rendered to the DOM. This is a good place to set up a timer. Okay, whenever the component mounts, we will have a timer here. Got it? And what this timer does, it takes in a function. As I said, it will first in the first argument it will take in a function. So we make a new function, an anonymous function, which returns this .tick. It returns this. So whatever the value you get from the tick function, it's going to return that, but we don't really care about the return. We just want this to be executed. Okay, note how we are saving the timer ID on this timer. Oh yeah, we do care about what it returns. Sheesh. Every 1000 seconds is going to return whatever the value comes from this tick. Oh yeah, I completely forgot that it's going to be assigned here. While this .props is set up by React itself, and this .state has a special meaning, you are free to add additional fields to the class manually if you need to store something that does not participate in the data flow, like the timer ID. What is the return value of set interval? Is it a value or is it an ID that you can, okay, maybe it's an ID that you can then stop this timer with. Yeah, and then we are storing this timer ID here, and we will tear down the timer in the component, and component will unmount lifecycle. Tear down, this is a very common term that is being used everywhere. Tear down means the destroying of some memory. Okay, just think of it like that. It's going to free up the memory. That's it. So we will call clear interval, and this takes in a timer.id. So if you actually go to MDN, you can easily see what the what our confusion is. If we just go to set interval and look up here, wow, it changes colors every time. Maybe this is a class, that's why. It's a, if you see, look at the URL, it's web JavaScript reference operators, and this is web API. So all the APIs are purple in color. Great. I like the purple color anyways. So it will return, the return value is a interval ID. It's a numeric non-zero value which identifies the timer created by the call to set an interval. You see, so it does not care what function it's going to execute. It's just going to create a new GUID, a unique ID, and that ID can be used to clear the interval by calling the clear interval function here. So this function will be executed when the component goes out of memory. Good to know. It will use this .set state to schedule updates to the component local stage. Tick function, we then call this .set state function. Now set state, we don't know what set state does as of now, but I think what it does, it just sets the state and it takes the key as date, and it's going to set the date here as a new date. Every 1000 seconds, every 1000 milliseconds is going to set it. Got it. Just a recap here. Set state, it doesn't tell about set state that much, but we will learn about it later. Using state correctly, there are 3 things you should know about set state. Do not modify the state directly. For example, this will not re-render a component. Okay, do not set it directly. This is wrong. Instead, you set state. The only place where you can assign this .state is the constructor. Okay, so we can assign it, but only one place, and constructor. So this rule needs to be validated. You know, this rule needs to be validated. That means we should have a linter here. Linter would detect that this .state has been set outside of the constructor, so it will throw an error. So that's the point of having linters. We should have it in advanced guide or somewhere. We'll see. State updates may be asynchronous. React may batch multiple set state calls into single update for performance. So it may be asynchronous. So you don't really know when it's going to be called. You just have to assume that it's going to be called at the right time. This is going to be quite challenging, because what if setting the state? Okay, yeah, that's why this is really bad. I completely forgot that set state is not going to be used anymore. So it will be used, but in hooks it's going to be used. So we can skim through this a little bit. Okay, what is this? Why is this wrong? Because this .props and this .state may be updated asynchronously, you should not rely on their values for calculating the next state. For example, this code may fail to update the counter. We are setting the counter as its state plus the increment value, which is absolutely wrong, as they say, because we don't know if state is going to be set now or later. To fix it, use a second form of set state that accepts a function rather than an object. That function will receive the previous state as first argument, and then oh, I see. So now we need to pass in a function into set state which passes the previous and the new previous state as the first argument, and the props at the okay, fine. We use an arrow function above, but it works with regular function as well. Got it. State updates are merged. When you call set state, React merges the object you provide into the current state. We have post here, comments here, and if you only want to update post, you can do it and without affecting the comments. So you can update post and comments independently. So you can have 1000 posts here, and if you just want to update the comments, you don't have to include this object of 1000 posts again, because it's going to be merged together. The merging is shallow. This is very important. So this set state comments leaves this .state.post intact, but completely replaces this .state.comments. The data flows down. Neither parent nor child component can know if a certain component is stateful or stateless. Okay, this is something that we can't skip through, because this is important regarding to the component. So what it means is the component may choose to pass its state as props to the child component. So date, yeah, we're passing the state as a props to the child component. Nothing that we didn't know about. Formatted date component would receive the date in its prop. Okay. This is commonly called a top-down or a unidirectional data flow. Any state is always owned by some specific component, and any data or UI derived from that state can only affect the component below. So it should be only independent, and like parent can send to child, but child cannot send to parent. Yeah, each clock sets up its own timer and updates independently. True. Handling events. React events are named using camel case rather than lowercase. With JSX, you pass a function as the event handler rather than a string. For example, the HTML, this is the HTML, is slightly different in React. Okay, yeah, in HTML we call the on click function, but here we call the onc click because this is an event and we need to name it properly using camel case. Got it? Another difference is that you cannot return false to prevent default behavior in React. Then you must call prevent default explicitly. Previously, what we used to do whenever we have a form and we click on the submit button, whenever you click the submit button, there is a rule in HTML, a weird ass rule, or I would say very old rule. It isn't used anymore, but like it's not required anymore. But the rule says is whenever you click a button, it needs to redirect, it needs to submit that form and going to redirect to some other place, and you need to tell where you want to redirect to. So and it's going to submit instantly. So if the type is submit and it's inside the form, if the button type is submit and it's inside the form, whenever you click on the submit button, it's going to submit the form to some API call is going to be made. Okay, what we used to do is we write the JavaScript code that we want to execute and then return false. If we return false, then we just say that don't submit the form. In React, this could be instead we need to have a handle submit function here, which takes an e as an event, and then we call e.prevent default. So this is the whole point of having prevent default here. We are not going to have any forms in this for now. Maybe we will have a form when we are going to create a dashboard type of a thing where I will be able to update this thing on the fly. E is synthetic event. React defines these synthetic events according to the I don't care. Okay, what is this? When you define a component using the ES6 class, a common pattern is, okay, this is important, right? Common pattern. A common pattern is for an event handler to be a method on the class. For example, toggle component renders a button that lets the user toggle on and off states. Where is the toggle button? This is handle bind. This binding is necessary to make this work in the callback. Oh, what the hell is this? Why do we need this bind? Okay, because in when we are going to use hooks, this bind is going to go away. You guys will see. So if we see here, handle click and click, this function is here inside the class. That's what they told about, that our function needs to be inside this class. Then what it needs to do is needs to set the state, and it's going to just toggle it. So whatever the previous state was, it's going to just take the previous state to a not of it and set it as the set state thing. Makes sense? Makes sense. But for this handle click to work, you need to bind it. So you need to bind this, all the whole the props, this dot state, this dot everything to handle click. To know more about it, what bind really does, you need to go into and check web empty. And should we check right now? It's going to get removed anyways. So, but yeah, this is a good JavaScript question. So if you guys are thinking of giving an interview, this is a very good question. Okay, yeah, this one, function.prototype.bind. This is something that I was looking for. The bind method creates a new function that when called has its this keyword set to the provided value. Creates a new function when called has its this keyword set to the provided value. Unbound x, we have a function here. We're binding it to the module. The module is a constant. So then whenever bound get x is being called, it will already have module inside of it. So it's like we are passing this const to this part, if you guys understand that way, that we are passing this state. So here we mean that handle dot bind this, so we are doing this dot state, right? So if we don't do this, if we don't bind it, then we will never have this here. You might be careful about meaning of this in JS callbacks. In JavaScript, class methods are not bound by default. If you forget to bind this dot handle click and pass it to the on click, this will be undefined when the function is already called, when it's actually called. Yeah, that's what I talked about. Because if this dot set state is not known until and unless you don't do bind. Yeah, it's not a React specific behavior. That's how functions work. What I want to know is, can you do we have a try it in code pen? Can we ignore this? We have an on off. So we are just toggling the name on and off. So if we don't use this, and if you see, yeah, now it does not work. It's still on, and it shows an error that cannot read properties of undefined. Now if we use something like this, where we do this, no, is equal to this. See, now it works using arrow functions. You don't need to bind it always. You can just use arrow functions. The point of having arrow functions is that it will not create a this of its own. If you think about it, a class is nothing but a function. Yeah, just we saw it previously, right? The class is nothing but a function, and this means its own values. But when we do an arrow function, it doesn't have this defined. It's going to use the global this, whatever this is of this class, if that makes any sense. But yeah, using arrow functions, you can avoid doing this, because then this is being referred from the class toggle. Important thing to know. See, I'm so genius, man. What a genius is sometimes scary. You can just use a arrow function like that. But here what they have done, they have created an arrow function here itself of handle click, which makes sense. Like they have removed a little bit of the code here. So rather than just doing this dot handle click and then we are just defining handle click, why are we defining handle click? We can define this function separately and then we can just bind it using an arrow function here. So it is one of the same thing. Okay, problem with this syntax is that a different callback is created each time the login button renders. In most cases this is fine. However, if this callback is passed as a prop to lower components, those components might do an extra re-render. True. We generally recommend binding in the constructor or using the class field syntax to avoid this sort of performance issue. Oh, wow, that's very true. So what happens is we are creating a function here. So I would say, why are you creating a function on its call? Then you can just use this one, right? This here, it's not going to get found. Like whenever this is rendered, whenever this HTML is rendered, it's not going to create handle click element or the memory of handle click again and again. It's just going to refer it. But if you use this syntax, then it's going to create it every time it's going to get rendered. So I don't know why. Passing arguments to the event handler inside a loop, it is common to pass it is common to want to pass an extra parameter for an event handler. For example, id is 0. Either of the things would work. We want to pass in the function e and id and e. I see. So it's a function, an anonymous function. E is the input. So if nothing is passed, then id is going to get passed. But if e is also passed, then it's going to be id comma e. So you can take e and pass it here, basically. Conditional rendering. This is like the ng if condition of React. Conditional rendering in React works the same way as conditions work in JavaScript. Use JavaScript operators like if or the conditional operator to create elements representing the current state and let React update the UIs to match them. You have user greeting, you have guest greeting, welcome back or please sign up. If the user is logged in, you will show welcome back. If it is not, then you will show please sign up. Yeah, you can do this. If this, then this. Conditional rendering. You can create a greeting component like this. And this example renders a different greeting depending on the value of is logged in. You can use variables to store elements. This can help you conditionally render a part of the component while the rest of the output doesn't change. So consider these two components representing the login and the logout buttons. So we have login button and we have a logout button. Both have a button and we on click, we are calling the on click function that is defined somewhere. We don't care about that, but it is defined somewhere, or is going to call the function that is going to be sent from this component. I see. In the example below, we will create a stateful component called login control. It will render either login button or logout button depending on its current state. It will also render a greeting from the previous example. So we created something as login control, and it's a stateful component. Stateful component means a component which definitely changes when the state changes, right? That's the stateful component. It changes when this that it has a state of its own. Login click, logout click, and in the constructor what we do is we bind these values and also we create a state as is logged in as false. That's the basic setup that we have. This all is required. This all is garbage code, by the way. This is going to be changed when we will work with hooks. So if you imagine you have 100 of things here, 100 of functions here, you would have 100 bind. So that's not really good. Okay, render. What are we doing? So we are taking the state dot is logged in. Whenever we are rendering, we are taking the state. That's fine. Okay, we can rely on taking the state value when it's rendered. And also that we are using set state to call it, so it's okay. Every time the state is going to change, this set state is function is going to be called, and this render function is going to be called. I think that's how React gets to know that when it has to render it once more, because the state value changes, or like the set state is being called. Let button, we are just creating a button, is logged in, then button equals to this. If not, then it becomes this, and then we return greeting with is logged in, and we are sending is logged in here, and is logged in is nothing but constant here, so true or false. Greeting, and then greeting we take it from here, I think. Yeah, greeting, user greeting. If it's logged in, then the user will say welcome back or please sign up. Okay, so what's stateful about it? Let's read through it. While declaring a variable and using an if statement is a fine way to conditionally render a component, sometimes you might want to use a shorter syntax. There are few ways to inline conditions in JSX explained below. Okay, a shorter syntax, if you want to write, you can do that. So I don't really understand what was really stateful about it, but you can just think that it has a state of its own. So if it has a state of its own, then and it's independent, then you can have two login controls at the same time on the same page, and they will act independently. There are a few ways to inline JSX. So what we have done here is we have just used a if condition and use and. So yeah, this is something that I do daily, like not daily, but every time I have to write the code in smaller ways, then I use this. So what happens here is there is a rule in JavaScript which says that if it's checking for a and condition, if the first thing fails, it's not going to do the second thing. It's not even going to read the second part, because we know it's and. So if the first is false, then it's not even going to do anything here. So you don't need to have a if condition written here. You can just use this combination of things where you pass in the first as expression, and if it evaluates to true, then only this will be called. Messages, we are passing react, re-react, re-react, and 100 messages as messages here. And if the length is 0, is greater than 0, then only will you have these many messages. So it's okay. It works because in JavaScript, true and expression always evaluates to the expression, and false and expression always evaluates to false. Oh, really? True and expression will always evaluate to the expression. So the return value of this part would be the expression rather than just the true. Nice. Good to know. A good JavaScript question, a good JavaScript interview question. Therefore, if the condition is true, the element right after the and will appear in the output. If it is false, the React will ignore it and skip it. Inline if else with conditional operator. Another method for conditionally rendering is to use inline. Yeah, you can use that. Easy. You check here, you do this, or you do not do this. Larger expression as well, you can do that. Okay, if we don't want to do this, then what is our condition? We don't want to do inline, then what we have to do? Then in the render function of this itself, just before it is returning it, yeah, we will set it to a variable like button here, and then we'll just pass in the button here. I see, because one issue came in Deloitte, I remember that. What happened was we had to write a complex logic of if else, and then also a switch case and some other parts, and the developers were trying to do it inside the inline operator only, because I think they didn't know that you can that inline is just an alternative to this approach, and the code was getting very unreadable, and he was struggling a lot to manage the states, but he was still like very adamant about it, that I want to do this, I want to use inline only. I was like, fine. I asked him that is it possible to do it without inline, because this looks very hectic, or this looks very complicated to read, and it's not readable at all. But he said no, it's not, there is not, this is how it's going to be. Okay, fine. I don't know React, he knows React. Okay, yeah, he was using these multiple times and also and multiple times. Weird. Preventing component from rendering. In rare cases, you might want to want a component to hide itself, yeah, like the ngIf of the false condition of ngIf. To do this, return null instead of its render output. So if it does not have it, just return null. Got it. Okay, list and keys. What is this? Okay, this is just plain old JavaScript. That's how you transform list into the double list. Yeah, you can use the map operator. Rendering multiple components. If you want to, you can build collections of elements and include them in JSX using curly braces. Before we loop through the numbers, okay, this is not related to the state, by the way, so you can like focus up here, and we need to read through it. Collection of elements and include them in JSX using the curly braces. Below, we loop through numbers and array using the JavaScript map function. We return an li element for each element. Finally, we assign these resulting array to list of items. So list of items, previously number was 1 2 3 4 5, and now we mapped it so it becomes li1, li2, li3, li4, li5, and then that is an array so it's an array of li things. So li1, li2, li3, li4, l4. So we have that. So we include the entire li streams, li items array inside an ul item and render. Wow. So if you think of this, if in Angular, what you had to use ng4 to do that. But here you could just create a list, and as soon as that list updates, it's going to get updated. Which is better though? Both are quite similar. What Angular does is it makes all the logic to come into the HTML as well. But which is better? In this case, we'll see if we can find any use case where in my history of using Angular, I could say that okay, React is doing it much better. And I'll just point that out. Usually you would render a list inside a component. We can refactor the previous example into a component that accepts an array of numbers and outputs a list of elements. So we have numbers. We create a component called number list. We pass in props.numbers. So this numbers, we are passing in the numbers array, and we are mapping it to li, and then we are just returning it. Crazy. So what will happen when we call the number list? A list of li will come, because we are mapping the whole thing into an array and just passing it here. When you run this code, you'll be given a warning that a key should be provided for list items. A key is a special string attribute that you need to include when creating a list of elements. We'll discuss why it's important in the next section. The keys section. Let's assign a key to our list of elements inside map and fix this missing key issue. I see. So what we do here is assign a key, and we make the number and make it go to string. So a key is nothing but an ID, I guess, to differentiate between the first one and the second one. Makes sense. Now let's think of keys here. Keys help React identify which items have changed, are added, or removed. You see, I told you, an identifier. Keys should be given to the elements inside the array to give the element a stable identity. Same thing. So we are now giving, so this is numbers, what we had. We are mapping to through it. So we are making 1, and we are returning li, and then we are making the key as our number.to string. So what will happen, that this key will get the string value of 1, and then we would have the next element which would have that would have a key with a value of 2, 3, 4, 5. Easy. The best way to pick a key is to use a string that uniquely identifies a list item among its sibling. Most often you would use IDs for your data as keys. I was thinking but IDs can be okay. If you don't have an ID, then what do you do? If I have a list of names and that I want to display, and I don't want to say that which one is which, I don't want to have a unique identifier, then also I'll have to use the key. So the best way is this, to pick a unique thing, but it's not limited to a unique thing. That's what I can think of right now. When you don't have stable IDs, then you may use the item index as a key. Okay, great. Great. To do analytics, yeah, true. Yeah, when you do a map, the first part is always the element. So to-dos will have the first part as the element of to-do, and then index would be the 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So index. We don't recommend using indexes for keys if the order of the items may change. Correct. This can negatively impact performance and may cause issues with the component state. Check out Robin's Pokorny's article for an in-depth explanation of the negative impact of using index as a key. If you choose not to assign an explicit key to list item, then React will default to using indexes as keys. So don't need to do this; it will automatically use index. Here is an in-depth explanation about keys. Why are they necessary? This is a very big issue in Angular. What happens is, I think it creates a new template reference for everything, so it doesn't matter if you provide a key or not. Yeah, this issue will never come in Angular though. Extracting components with keys. Keys only make sense in the context of the surrounding array. If, for example, if you extract a list item component and you should keep the key of the list item list item elements in the array rather than on the list items in the list item itself. What do you mean? Okay, let us see. We have numbers here, then we are passing it to the number list. So always go from top to down if you're reading some React code or even Angular. So always go top to down. So you see number list, we see numbers are being passed. And let's see what this number list does. It does what it does. It takes in the props, it takes in the numbers, it maps it, and we are mapping the value of this. Okay, we are sending the value of it as number, and it's going to return a list of items. And here what we are doing, the key should have been specified here. It should not, there is no need to specify the keys here. So only specify the key where you are looping. Don't specify the key inside a component, a child component, inside wherever we are looping. So we are looping it here, and if you see in map, so this is where we need to specify the key. Here if you think of this list item as a component, this is just a plain list item component. This does not have need a key at all. So we have never defined a key for a static one element returning thing, right? So why do we need the key here? Just do it here. Got it. So yeah, that's what we are doing. We are specifying the key here. Keys must be unique among siblings. Applying okay. Siblings keys used, however, they don't need to be globally unique. We can use the same keys when we produce two different arrays. Yeah, that is what my doubt was. So if you have posts here, you're sending in post in blog, and then you have blog here, you're sending in props, and then props.post, we are doing it here, and we're mapping it, and we're passing it as key because we are mapping it here. And then that's the sidebar, that's the content. We are doing a whole map again. This post id will be equal to this post id always, because we are mapping to the same array twice. This time here we have sidebar and content, so sidebar and content will have the same key. So this is fine, they say, because siblings should have it, but there is no need for two global things to have it, right? This is fine. Keys serve as a hint to React, but they don't get passed to your components. If you need the same value in your component, pass it explicitly as a prop with a different name. So don't pass it as a key, pass it as a title, or name, pass it as an ID. Don't pass it as a key. Okay. Embedding map in JSX, we declared a separate list item variable and included in the JSX. What have we done? So it takes an array, it loops through the array, it creates a list item, value number, then okay, what is so big about it? JSX allows embedding any expression in curly braces, so we could inline the map result directly in the number list itself. So no need to create list items here. You could directly map inside the JSX itself. I see. Now I see why this is important. I see. Very important. Sometimes this result is clearer code, but this style can also be abused, like in JavaScript. It is up to you to decide whether it is worth extracting a variable for readability. Keep in mind that if map body is too nested, it might be good time to extract a component. If it's true nested, then just create one component for one map for just for readability. Forms, I don't think we will go through forms today, because forms we are not going to use until we are done with our whole website thing. So that will do it later. And lifting state up. What is this? Often several components need to reflect the same changing data. We recommend lifting the shared state up to the closest common ancestor. Let's see how this works in action. In this, okay, so what do they mean? Recommend lifting the shared state up to the closest common ancestor. Ancestor means parent, and closest common. Weird. Let's see this section. Yeah, this is going to be cool to read about, because I don't have even a clue what they mean. In this section, we will create a temperature calculator that calculates whether the water would boil at a given temperature. We will start with the component called boiling verdict. it accepts the Celsius temperature as a prop and prints whether it is enough to boil the water or not. So if the prop is more than 100, then it would boil. If not, okay. Very simple component, very simple component. Next, they could have even used a and to do this, but they have used an if condition. Okay. Next, we will create a component called calculator. It renders an input that lets you enter the temperature and keeps its value in the state temperature. It deals with inputs, but we'll try to make sense out of it. We have input here. We have created a calculator class, which what it does, it has a field set legend and then input here with on change, handle change, which handle change is we are binding it to this, and then boiling verdict is a Celsius, and then we are doing parse float, and parse float is a JavaScript function, so we don't need to bind it or don't need to create it here. And what it does, it just takes the temperature and parses it as a float, or the opposite. Parse int, what it does is takes in a string and parses it as an integer. Yeah, so this takes in a string and then parses it as a float. Got it? What about the input? What does it do? On change, it's going to change value of state temperature and give it here, and then boiling. Okay, so what is wrong with this? This is correct, right? What's the issue with this? Our new requirement is that in addition to Celsius input, we provide a Fahrenheit input, and they are kept in sync. Oh, kept in sync. That means Celsius input, as it changes, the Fahrenheit also should change. We can start by extracting the temperature input component from the calculator. Scale names is just a constant, and we just want the value of scale. So scale, the value of scale is coming from props.scale. So whatever the value, so this has an input of temperature. No, it has an input of temperature and scale. So it's going to take scale if the scale is having the value of C, then it's going to be Celsius. If it has the value of F, then it's going to be Fahrenheit, and enter the temperature in is going to change to either Celsius or Fahrenheit as a string. So it would be enter temperature in Fahrenheit or enter temperature in Celsius. Oh, then how is going to do the calculation though? You can now change the calculator to render two separate temperature inputs, C and F. Okay, you have two temperatures. Okay, and you want to maintain the state of them, so it is synchronous. This is a basic concept in Angular, that whenever you want to have a child can never contact another child. A child can never contact its sibling. That's the rule in any component based architecture, that this child is independent of this child. So if it needs to contact a sibling child, all the contact needs to be done via the parent component. So that is what they wanted to say with recommend lifting the shared state up to the closest common ancestor. We have two inputs now, but you want to enter the temperature in one of them, the other doesn't update. This contradicts our requirement. We want to keep them in sync. Yeah, because these two will be always independent. So if you do any changes in this input, it will not reflect here. But we want to make it equal. So whenever this temperature input gets updated, you need to let the calculator know that values got changed, and that value will be passed into the temperature input, and that is going to change it dynamically. Writing conversion functions. Okay, we just written two conversion functions. Number. It returns an empty string on invalid temperature and it rounds it up. Okay, now lifting this data. Currently both temperature inputs components are independently keep their values in their local state. True. However, we want these values to be in sync. So this is I remember I had to look into Angular, how we can do this using Angular. In Angular, we can send it towards the parent, or we can use a shared service to keep track of that. What I like is I like the parent one more than the shared service. Creating a service in Angular, I think is just too much overhead, computational overhead. In React, sharing state is accomplished by moving it up to the closest ancestor. This is called lifting the state up. You are not new, bro. Don't act cool. This is basics of any component design. We will remove the local state from the temperature input and move it to the calculator itself. If the calculator owns the shared state, it becomes a source of truth for the current temperature in both inputs. It can instruct them both to have values that are consistent to each other. So we need something to update it. So that's, please just itna hi to hai. Why are you making it so complicated? First, we will replace this dot state temperature with this dot tops temperature. We already know that props are read only. When the temperature was in local state, the temperature could just call this dot set state to change it. However, now that is temperature is coming from the parent as a prop, the temperature input has no control over it. Oh, okay, what have you done? Before was constant temperature is equal to state dot temperature. So, oh, you have access to props and state both, and state is immutable. Like state is mutable. You can change state however many times you want, and it's going to be common. It's not going to be common, it's going to be very individual. But props is something which is just the JavaScript way of doing it. In JavaScript, if you change some value inside an object, that value will be changed in all of its references. So handle change. So we create a on temperature change function we created. Did we create it or do we get it? In React, this is usually solved by making a component controlled, just like the DOM input accepts a value and on change prop. So the custom temperature input accepts both temperature and on temperature change props from its parent calculator. Now when the temperature input wants to update its temperature, it calls this dot props dot on temperature change. I see. So whenever the temperature has changed, this function is going to get called. Yeah, very, very easy. There is no special meaning to either temperature or on temperature change prop names in custom components. We could have called them anything else, like names, and like name the value and on change, which is a common convention. Value and then on change. Okay, you can call that value and on change. Temperature change prop will be provided with the temperature prop by the parent. Yeah. So basically how Angular works, you will have that in round arrows, right? In round arrows you will pass in a function that is going to get called. So here what's going to happen is input, we are having a value as temperature and on change. Same way we are going to have in the temperature input, we are going to take okay, there should be one more like calculator. Here. So now we are going to add an on temperature change as a function, and that function is going to be handle Celsius change. Handle Celsius change, you have to write it here, and if it uses this, then you have to declare it as a bind. So this all you can just see, just by adding two functions, the whole code gets so big. Like that's the issue with this. Like so hard to read. So we have this on temperature change, on handle Fahrenheit change, and handle Celsius change. So whenever this function is getting called, whenever the code is reaching this point of line, then what we are going to do, we are just setting the value, but we should calculate it first. No, handle Celsius change takes in a temperature, sets the scale as C and temperature. Okay, every time you render, it's going to try convert it. I see. If scale is strictly equal to F, then try to convert it, or else put the Celsius as okay. You guys get this? This is very weird though. So what they are doing, they are only keeping one scale at a time. Either it's going to be C or it's going to be F. If the last input was C, then it's going to be C. If the last input that we have done manually was F, then it's going to be F. And whenever some value changes, then handle Celsius change or handle Fahrenheit change function will be called. Whenever any one of them gets called, then set state function is going to get called. Whenever set state function is going to get called, the render function is going to get called. When the render function is going to get called, it's going to calculate the Celsius and Fahrenheit, and it's going to send it as inputs. It's a very long way of doing this, but it works. I think that's about it. Lifting the state up, composition versus inheritance. I want to read through this because this is nothing very theoretical. We are not going to learn anything here. It's just going to be how you think in React, like how it's just best practices thing. React has a powerful composition model, and we recommend using composition instead of inheritance to reuse code between components. In this section, we will consider a few problems where developers new to React often reach for inheritance and show how we can solve this with composition. What is composition and what is inheritance, we'll have to see. Do you remember what composition was? Nah, I don't remember. I think composition is just is it just that it's a component? That's it. Composition versus inheritance. We have never seen inheritance though. We have only seen our base class is going to extend react.component, but that's it. Some components don't like their children ahead of time. This is especially common for components like sidebar or dialog. that represent generic boxes. We recommend that such inputs use the special children prop to pass children elements directly into their output. Special child children prop. Oh, you want a unique fancy border is going to have color as well as children. No, I don't understand. This lets other component pass arbitrary children to them by nesting the JSX. Okay. So props is an object, and then one key in that JavaScript object JSON is color, and one key is children, and children has the value of JSX. We have the value of h1, h2, h3 there. This lets components pass arbitrary children to them by nesting the JSX. Oh shit. Wow, this is amazing though. Sheesh. So what's happening here is we have a div. When this gets rendered, this is not going to get actually it's going to get rendered exactly like this. But you can think of this as this children. We don't need to specify dot children or and create a variable and put it like that. We can just pass this arbitrarily. So we can just pass it inside its closing and opening brackets. We have never done this before. What in the previous examples what we have seen, it would be fancy border and then space and then slash. So that means closing. And then we would not pass a child here. Nice. And we will use props.children to just render it. Anything inside fancy border, it's passed into the fancy border component as a child prop. While this is less common, I know, yeah, sometimes it's not even useful, but sometimes it's very, very useful. While this is less common, sometimes you might need multiple holes in a component. In such case, you might come up with your own convention instead of using child. So what you do a left and this and right a chart, and then you do left and right. Makes sense. Yeah, they are just like objects, so you can pass them as props like any other data. This approach may remind you of slots in other libraries, but there are no limitation on what you can pass. Yeah, great. Now specialization, they okay, in this article they will not talk about inheritance, but they will in the end will say that inheritance is something that we don't support, and we do support, but we don't really recommend you to do that. But okay, let's see of specialization. I have not so they confuse me with these terms as containment and specialization, and these things will be asked in the interview if you ever come across it. So it's important though. Sometimes we think about components as being special cases of other components. For example, we might say that welcome dialog is a special case of dialog. True. This is a very common case where you need multiple dialogs. You need one dialog for welcome, one you need for cancel, one you need for accept, something like that. If you guys don't know what a dialog box is something which pops up. Either it will ask you to add like enter some value, or it just pops up saying that okay, some your changes have been saved. So some pop-up kind of thing. So we create a function. So we create a component as dialog box, and we create a welcome dialog box which returns a dialog box. So we are saying that welcome dialog box is a kind of a dialog box which has some properties hard coded inside of it. Is that just it? The composition works equally well for component defined as classes. Composition की बात कहाँ से आ गई? So dialog box is taking a children and this displaying it here, and fancy border is also taking a children and going to just okay. Yeah, this makes sense. Specialization is nothing. So specialization is nothing where we just have that the title is hard coded. For all the sign up dialog box, it will be hard coded. That's the whole point of specialization, I see. Which in the case, why do we really need that specialization? Maybe we want to couple this because we can just use dialog, right? Why to do like call it specialization? My question is, sign me up, we are passing it as a children, and we are also passing this as a children, and we are also passing this as a children. Okay, this button is okay, sign me up is not a children. This button itself is a whole child in its own. Okay, because we are using props.title here. The title value comes from this title, and message value comes from this message, and children comes from this, like this whole thing. So it's going to render a fancy border. Oh, fancy border. The whole point of doing a fancy border was that you can have a fancy border. That's it. Like a border which has the class name of dialog title, I guess. Fancy border, I forgot what the use of fancy border was. I think just the color blue we are sending, right? Yeah, we are making the class name as fancy border hyphen color. Okay, this is going to be useful. I'll show you why. In Duskblade app, we have this buttons here, and I want to sometimes pass value. I sometimes want to pass Fortnite, and sometimes wants to pass different. So this button itself is going to be a component, and we are going to pass a Valorant or Valo or and Fortnite, and then when we pass Fortnite, then this button color changes. The F icon will appear here from Fortnite. So like that, we are going to make use of that here. Okay. What about inheritance? As at Facebook, we use React in thousands of component, and we haven't found any use cases where we would recommend creating component inheritance hierarchies. So never you should create component inheritance hierarchies. This is even true in Angular. In Angular, you can you extend something, right? You extend ng on init, you extend ng on destroy, and stuff like that. Ng on changes, ng on view init. You extend that, but you can extend and if you think in services, you extend, I think, HTTP. No, you don't extend there. Okay, you don't extend there. But instead of extending ng on init, you can extend another class as well, another component you can extend. Theoretically it's possible, but we never do that because it doesn't make sense to inheritance. So I too haven't found any case where I would do an inheritance in Angular. So it means that inheritance is really not required. If you want to reuse your non-UI functionality between components, we suggest extracting into a separate JavaScript module. That means just a separate JavaScript file. The components may import it and use that function, object, or a class without extending it. Okay, I don't know, but maybe we'll see later. Thinking in React. Okay, if you have to think, start with the mock. Didn't I tell you so? Break the UI into a component hierarchy. True, you need to break it into a reusable hierarchy. Build a static version in React. Didn't I tell you so? I have a static version here. And then brief interlude, props versus state. Identify the minimal but complete representation of the UI state. If you think about this, they have never talked about how we manage the CSS of this. In Angular, we manage the CSS using .css, component.css. But here, I think we don't have that limitation. We can use CSS however we want. Okay, with this, they say DRI, don't repeat yourself. So you don't have to do anything multiple times. If you do, like, if you find something which is getting repeated multiple times, but then you can just create it into a component. That's what. Figure out the absolute minimal representation. For example, if you're building a to-do list, keep an array of to-do items around. Don't keep a separate state variable for the count. Instead, when you want to render the to-do count, take the length of the to-do item array. True, because if you keep the value of count, then what will happen? You need to, as soon as something gets updated and added into the to-do items array, you'll have to update the count as well. It's too much duplication of code, right? So don't do it. People do this in big organizations like Deloitte, and it's quite hard for me to explain to them, like, this is fine, it's working. It doesn't mean that it's good. Let's go through each one of it and figure out which one is state. Ask 3 questions about piece of data. Is it passed in from a parent via prop? If so, it probably isn't state, huh? Does it remain unchanged over time? If so, it probably isn't state. Can you compute it based on any other state or props in your component? If so, if it isn't state. Oh, I thought I would put everything in state. Okay, this is where I learn. Is it passed in from a parent via props? Does it remain unchanged over time? Yeah, this is true. If it is not changed over time, then it is not contributing to the state of that component. So if we say width of a button, if you consider width of this button, it's not changing over time. So you can think of this as something which is not a state, but the color is a state. Is it? No, it's not. It's an input. An input is not state. The state here would be if I had to make any changes here, like this value of Duskblade changes over time. That would be a state. But that just covers the second part. What about the first part? Yeah, inputs are not states. Can you compute it based on any other state or props in your component? Think of this list. The count is not the state because you can calculate the count. So don't use it as a state, because if you have to use it as a state, then it goes into the set state, and set state will re-render the whole thing. So it becomes very, very computationally heavy. I guess I see what they want us to do. If it does not change anything, don't add into the state, because it doesn't matter. It's never going to get updated. So don't add it to the state. So that's the second point. If it's passed in via prop, then why is it this not a state? Because the value that is getting passed in from parent is always dynamic. As soon as the input changes, the component will re-render itself automatically. So don't add it to the state, because it will always be passed in from the component, and always it will get updated. So, and can you compute it? Yeah, compute it. That means it's constant. At one time, it's going to be always constant. So you can always compute it. Don't calculate as, because whenever you will calculate, it will, you call the set state, and set state will refresh the whole thing again. So don't do that. This is important though. Nice. The original list of products is passed in as props, so that's not a state. The search text and the checkbox seem to be state, since they change over time and cannot be computed from anything. That's true, the state of that particular thing. So if I have a button which is depressed, like not mentally but depressed, like pressed, okay, then for how long it's going to be pressed, that can be thought of as a state. Or if it's a toggle, if it's an on and off, or a checkbox on and off, can you compute it? Okay, yeah, that ho gaya. And finally, the filtered list of products isn't state, because it can be computed by combining the list. Yeah, the filter list also is not state, right? So finally, our state is the search text and the value of the checkbox. Identify where your state should live. Sometimes the state should live in the parent, and sometimes it should live inside as a child component. For each piece of state in your application, identify every component that renders something based on the state. Find a common owner component, a single component above all the components that needs the state in hierarchy. Okay, this is the one that I talked about, that you when you have to do sibling communication, either the common owner or another component even higher up in the hierarchy should set the state. If you can't find a component where it makes sense to own the state, create a new component solely for holding the state and add it somewhere in the hierarchy above the common owner component. Let us think of some example which follows here, because this is these things will guide you how you have to think in React. This is what makes a good React developer, or like a React just a developer, a good React developer. This is what they need to get into the mindset of. So first we need to identify every component that renders something based on that state. If we think of our application, we don't have any states here, by the way. None. I don't need states here. Do I need states here? Imagine if this is okay. Imagine you make an API call. You get all the data in one API call. You get the data about this description, and you get the data about what image is going to be used, etc. Then this should not have a state, because at one point this is always going to be constant. So the state holder should be the parent component. The parent component of this part would be the one which has this logo flashing. That would be the parent component. But this component also does not change over time. So this should not have a state. So it's even the parent component, the whole website should have one common state. Okay, add inverse data flow. Pro Eagles, hi, welcome to the chat. Beta.react.org. New React docs beta is live. We are rewriting the React documentation with a few different changes. All explanations are written using hooks rather than classes. We have added the React interactive examples with visual diagrams. This is a work in progress. And is this written by the actual Facebook people? I think it has. Will this site remain the I see. Learning React is 70% done. API reference is only 5% done. I was thinking the same thing, that if it's getting deprecated or it has been deprecated for so long, why are they not updating the documentation for the new developers? Good. Will this site replace the main site? We aim to switch this site to the main site once we reach content parity with the existing React documentation. The old website will be archived at a subdomain, so you'll still be able to access it. Old content links will redirect to the archived subdomain, which will have a notice about outdated content. But anyhow, I linked it because the normal React doc teaches class-based components, and 99.5 React will percent of them will not need class-based components. Exactly. I was also thinking the same thing, that why am I spending so much time thinking of states and things like that? But rather I should work and go to hooks and just learn about use effect, use like we have so many hooks there which redefine the life cycle of a component. But then I thought that I have a introducing hooks and then we have a video here. So Dan Abramov just compared the previous one with the new one, so I need to know the previous one before starting with the new one. So that's why I was going through everything one by one. Now the thing is, it's 70% done. How much of that can I use? Like, will that be efficient, like sufficient